Here, on the banks of the Nolichucky River, the water still speaks in the old tongue of the mountains. It tumbles over rocks that have seen empires rise and fall, and it whispers through trees that remember a time when this was the very edge of the world. It was here, in this misty East Tennessee valley, that a man came and took the river's name for his own, branding himself into the landscape forever. They called him Nolichucky Jack. But was he a hero, a rebel, or a king in buckskin? Today, we're going to follow the current back in time, because these waters hold a story of fire, blood, and ambition that shaped the very soul of Appalachia. Let's go back to 1773. Imagine this valley not as a quiet, settled place, but as the raw, bleeding edge of a new continent. This was a world of towering hardwoods and shadow-filled hollows, where the law was whatever a man could enforce with a long rifle and a steady hand. The settlements here, places like Watauga and Holston, weren't towns. They were clusters of raw log cabins huddled together for warmth and safety, islands in a vast, untamed wilderness. This was land that was promised by God, but forbidden by a king across the ocean, and more importantly, it was the ancestral hunting ground of the Cherokee. Into this crucible walked John Sevier. He wasn't born of these mountains. He was a man from Virginia with a hunger for land that was sharper than any axe. When he arrived and built his home on the Nolichucky, he didn't look like a mountain-born brawler. He was handsome, charming, with a gaze that could disarm a rival or win the loyalty of a stranger in a single glance. He had the easy smile of a man who knew deep in his bones that you'd follow him, that you'd trust him with your life. But those who looked closer saw something else. Beneath the charisma was a core of cold, hard steel. This wasn't just a farmer looking for a homestead. This was a born leader, a speculator, a man who saw this forbidden land not just as a home, but as an empire in the making. He was building a life here with his wife and children, but every nail he hammered was an act of defiance against a distant government and a declaration of war against the people who had called this place home for centuries. The air itself was thick with tension. To the west, Cherokee leaders like Dragging Canoe watched the endless stream of settlers and swore a blood oath to drive them back across the mountains. To the east, the whispers of rebellion against the British Crown were growing into a roar. Sevier and his neighbors were caught in the middle, squatters on stolen land, poised on the brink of a war that would force them to choose a side. They had come seeking freedom, but they had found themselves in a powder keg, and John Sevier was the man holding the match. To really understand what forged John Sevier from a simple settler into a legend, you can't just look at maps or read treaties. You have to feel the weight of the times. I'm holding a piece of that weight right here in my hands. It's a trade tomahawk, the kind that were mass-produced in English foundries. The iron head is simple, brutal, and efficient. The hickory handle is smooth from a century of handling. It feels cold, balanced, and deadly. But this isn't just an antique weapon. This is a political document written in steel. When the revolution began, the British had a strategy for their southern frontier: turn the mountains red. They funneled weapons like this one to the Cherokee and other tribes, encouraging them to attack the rebellious settlements. For the British, it was a calculated move in a global war. But for the families living in those isolated cabins, it meant this object became a symbol of their worst nightmares. It was the face of a war that didn't happen on distant battlefields, but on their own doorsteps. This simple tool forces us to ask a visceral question, one that cuts through the pages of history. What happens when the world outside your thin wooden walls is consumed by fire and screams? What does a man like John Sevier do when he's looking over the palisade of a besieged fort and sees a young woman running for her life, with a weapon just like this one slicing through the air right behind her? When the revolution finally broke, it wasn't a glorious affair of flags and cannons on the frontier. It was a wave of pure terror. The British strategy was simple and brutal. They would unleash their allies, the Cherokee, upon the settlements. The war had come to the mountains, and it came on silent, moccasined feet, armed with English steel. Suddenly, every rustle in the woods, every shadow at dusk, could mean death. Cabins were burned, families scattered, and the survivors fled to the flimsy security of their forts. At Fort Watauga, the air was thick with the stench of fear and gunpowder. Hundreds of Cherokee warriors, led by the brilliant and implacable Dragging Canoe, materialized from the forest and laid siege to the crude wooden walls. Inside, John Sevier was no longer just a landowner. He was a commander, responsible for the lives of every man, woman, and child huddled within. The siege was a grinding nightmare of sniper fire, of terrifying war cries that echoed through the night, a constant reminder that death was only a few feet of log wall away. It was during this chaos that the legend of Nolichucky Jack was truly born. A young woman, Catherine Sherrill, was caught outside the walls when the attack began. As she sprinted across the cleared ground toward the fort, she was a lone figure of desperation. She could hear the footsteps pounding behind her, could feel the nearness of her pursuers. A tomahawk, a weapon just like this one, its polished edge glinting in the sun, whizzed past her ear and thudded into the gate just as she reached it. It was barred shut. For a heart-stopping second, her hope died. But from the top of the wall, John Sevier had seen it all. As Catherine, in a final act of pure will, leapt for the top of the palisade, his hands shot out, grabbing her arms and hauling her over the edge to safety. In that single breathtaking moment, Sevier became more than a man. He became a protector, a hero. The seeds of conflict, sown by a distant king, had just bloomed into a very personal war for him, and that heroic rescue planted the seeds of a love story that would itself become a cornerstone of Appalachian folklore. History books can give you the dates and the names, but they can't give you the soul of a story. For that, you have to talk to the people who are its living keepers. My search for the soul of the King's Mountain story led me to the back room of a county historical society, a place that smelled of old paper and cedar. It's there I met a local historian, a man in his 80s whose family had been in these hills since before Tennessee was even a dream. His name isn't important. What is important is that the stories of this place run in his blood. I asked him about Major Ferguson's threat. Why did it light such a fire? Why march over a frozen mountain on what looked like a suicide mission? He leaned back in his creaky wooden chair and gave me a look that said I was asking the wrong question entirely. "You have to understand," he said, his voice a low Appalachian rumble. "Ferguson didn't threaten an army. There was no army. He threatened their Hearthstones." He explained that these weren't soldiers who answered to a distant general. They were clans. They were families. Their loyalty was to the man whose land bordered their own, to the neighbor who helped them raise a barn. When Patrick Ferguson promised to hang their leaders and lay their country waste with fire and sword, it wasn't a threat of war. It was a promise of annihilation aimed directly at their wives, their children, and their homes. "My great-great-great-uncle was there," the old man continued, tapping a weathered finger on a map. "Family law says he was plowing a field when the rider came with the news. He didn't even unhitch the mule. He just dropped the reins, walked into his cabin, took his long rifle from over the fireplace, and told his wife he'd be back when it was done." That single image, passed down through generations, tells you more than any history book. This wasn't a political calculation. It was a personal insult, a blood feud declared on an entire people. And it was an insult that could only be answered one way. Major Patrick Ferguson's threat was a spark on dry tinder. It wasn't heard in a government hall. It was carried by riders from one isolated settlement to the next, a whispered promise of hellfire that spread through the mountains like a contagion of rage. This wasn't a challenge to an army. It was a personal insult, a vow to burn out the very heart of the over-mountain people. And in that moment, something shifted in the soul of the frontier. The time for talk was over. The time for defense was over. This was now a hunt. The gathering at Sycamore Shoals was not a military muster, it was a human flood. Men poured out of the hollows and down from the ridges, their faces set like stone. They were a rough-hewn army, clad in buckskin and homespun, their only uniform a shared fury. Their weapon was the American long rifle, a tool of subsistence that had become an instrument of vengeance. They left their plows in the field, their harvests in the barn, and their families with a grim promise to return. In the center of this storm of men stood John Sevier. Alongside Isaac Shelby, he was the axis around which this whole desperate enterprise turned. He didn't need to give speeches. His presence was enough. He moved through the camp, his piercing gaze meeting the eyes of farmers and hunters, transforming their individual anger into a singular, deadly purpose. He was one of them, but he was also more. He was the embodiment of their defiance. The decision was made. They would not wait for Ferguson to bring his fire and sword to them. They would take the war to him. They would do the unthinkable, march over the high, snow-dusted peaks of the Appalachians, leaving their own homes vulnerable to hunt down a superior British force. This was the point of no return. As they turned their faces east and began their climb into the freezing autumn air, they were no longer just settlers. They were an avalanche of buckskin and fury, and they would not stop until they had buried Ferguson and his army on a mountain of his own choosing. Today, King's Mountain is a place of profound peace. You can walk the paved trails, hear the wind rustling the leaves, and read the solemn granite monuments that mark the place where a battle turned the tide of a war. But the true evidence, the real scar left on this landscape, isn't carved in stone. It's the land itself. You have to leave the path and feel the ground under your feet to understand what happened here. This isn't a mountain in the way you might imagine. It's a long, steep-sided ridge that rises abruptly from the surrounding country. When Major Ferguson brought his loyalist army up here, he thought he had found the perfect fortress. From this high ground, he could see in every direction, and he believed no army could assault such a steep, rugged slope. He was so confident, he reportedly boasted that he was king of this mountain, and that God Almighty and all the rebels out of hell could not drive him from it. He saw a fortress. He failed to understand that he was choosing a tomb, right here. Stand at the bottom of the slope and look up. You can feel the steepness in your legs and your lungs. This is where it happened. Ferguson's men were arrayed on the cleared summit, a perfect target against the skyline. But the over-mountain men didn't attack in formation. They used the dense woods on these slopes for cover, melting between the very trees that still stand here today. Each of these ancient oaks, each of these weathered rock outcroppings, became a silent testament to the chaos of that day. This whole ridge became a killing jar, and the over-mountain men were about to seal the lid. It began with a sound that was not quite human. From the base of the mountain on all sides, a terrifying chorus of whoops and yells erupted from the trees, the sound of panthers, of wolves, of men who had become something primal. The over-mountain men didn't march. They swarmed up the wooded slopes, a relentless tide of buckskin and iron will. It was a kind of warfare the British had never truly understood. For every volley of musketry the Loyalists fired down the hill, hitting little more than bark and shadow. A dozen puffs of white smoke would answer from the trees below. The crack of the long rifles was sharp, personal. Each one was a sentence of death delivered from an unseen judge. A man in a bright red coat would be reloading on the summit, and then he would simply fold, vanishing into the chaos. The Loyalists charged with bayonets, a wave of disciplined steel meant to break any line, but there was no line to break. The frontiersmen just melted back into the forest, letting the charge pass, only to rise up on their flanks and rear, their rifles speaking again and again. The fortress had become a slaughter pen. Above the din, Major Ferguson's silver whistle could be heard, a shrill, piercing note trying to impose order on pure chaos. He rode his white horse back and forth across the summit, a magnificent, defiant target rallying his crumbling lines. For an hour, the mountain was consumed by a storm of lead and fury. The air grew heavy and acrid with the smell of gunpowder. The roar of battle was continuous, a deafening drumbeat of rifle fire, screams and war cries. Then, suddenly, the silver whistle fell silent. The man on the white horse, who had seemed invincible just moments before, reeled in his saddle. He swayed for a moment, a stunned look on his face, before sliding to the ground. With his fall, the last bit of fight drained from the loyalist force. White handkerchiefs began to appear, tied to the ends of ramrods and held aloft in surrender. The shooting didn't stop immediately. The raw fury that had carried them over a frozen mountain demanded a final terrible price. But soon, a new sound replaced the gunfire, the triumphant, breathless roar of men who knew they had just broken the back of the British war in the south. After the gunsmoke clears, the ink begins to flow. This is a copy of the official report on the Battle of King's Mountain, written by the commanders and sent to the Continental Congress. It's written in the formal, looping script of the 18th century, and its language is as detached as the battle itself was intimate and brutal. It talks of troop movements, of casualties, and of objectives secured. It describes the battle in a single, sanitized phrase: a sharp conflict. A sharp conflict. Those three words are the cold ashes left over from a raging fire. There is no mention in this dry report of the war cries that echoed through the trees, or the raw fury of men avenging a threat against their homes. The official record doesn't tell you about the terror in the eyes of the loyalists as they were swarmed from all sides, or the grim satisfaction of the frontiersmen as they won. The paperwork of war is always a ghost of the real thing, a sterile summary that strips away the blood and the humanity. And this is where the story of John Sevier takes its most important turn. In this document, he is a hero of the new United States, a loyal officer serving the cause of liberty. But what this paper trail doesn't show is what was happening in Sevier's own mind. He had just seen how power was won, not in distant congresses, but by the will of determined men with rifles in their hands. As he rode home over the mountains, a hero of continental fame, he wasn't just thinking about the war he had won, he was thinking about the kingdom he was about to build. The official record sealed his legend as a patriot, but it was a title he was already preparing to betray. The hero returned from King's Mountain not just to a home, but to a vacuum of power. North Carolina, broke and exhausted from the war, ceded its western lands to the federal government, effectively abandoning the over-mountain settlements. Left without courts, laws, or protection, the people did what they had always done. They took matters into their own hands. In 1784, they declared themselves a new, independent state, the state of Franklin, and there was only one man they would trust to be its governor, John Sevier. For a brief, shining moment, Nolichucky Jack was a king in his own right, ruling over a renegade republic carved out of the wilderness. But the law, however distant, has a long memory. North Carolina quickly regretted its decision and reasserted its claim, creating chaos. Two governments now claimed the same land. The conflict became a bitter personal feud between Sevier and a man named John Tipton, a former brother-in-arms from Kings Mountain who now led the North Carolina Loyalist faction. This wasn't a political debate, it was a civil war in miniature, a clash of two frontier titans who refused to bend. The breaking point came in the dead of winter. Tipton's faction, acting for North Carolina, seized some of Sevier's enslaved people as payment for back taxes. For Sevier, this was the ultimate insult. Enraged, he raised a small army and laid siege to Tipton's farm. The Battle of Franklin was a tragic farce played out in a blizzard. For days, the two sides traded insults and gunfire from behind fences and trees until a surprise attack by Tipton's reinforcements shattered Sevier's force. The state of Franklin collapsed in the snow and mud, and its governor was now a wanted man. The law's pursuit began. The hero of King's Mountain was now a fugitive, hiding in the very mountains that had once hailed him as their savior. He was hunted by the government of North Carolina, the state he had once defended so ferociously. The cheers of victory were replaced by the quiet footsteps of a man on the run, a king with no kingdom, charged with the high crime of treason. Eventually, the law caught up with him. He wasn't captured in a blaze of glory, but arrested quietly, a shocking humiliation for a man of his stature. They put him in irons. Imagine that sight. Nolichucky Jack, the Indian fighter, the revolutionary commander, being hauled back over the mountains, not as a hero, but as a common felon. The tense journey ended at the courthouse in Morganton, North Carolina, where he was to be tried for his life. But as he stood before the court, a different kind of justice arrived. A mob of his armed followers stormed the building, freed him from his captors, and set him back on his horse. The official verdict was never delivered, because the people of the frontier had already delivered their own. John Sevier simply rode away, a free man, proving that in Appalachia, the loyalty of the people could be a law unto itself. To find the final chapter of this story, you have to visit two very different pieces of ground. The first is here, on the lawn of the old Knox County Courthouse, in the heart of the city he helped build. A grand stone monument marks the final resting place of John Sevier. It proclaims him a hero, a patriot, the first governor of the state of Tennessee. He lies here in a place of ultimate public honor, celebrated as a founding father. But as you stand here, you can't help but feel the paradox. This is the grave of a man who was once arrested, put in irons, and charged with high treason. To understand the other side of that conflict, you have to travel a few miles away to a quieter place. Here, on the rolling farmland that was once his home, lies John Tipton. His grave is simple, solid, unyielding, much like the man himself who stood for the law when it was unpopular and faced down the most famous man on the frontier. He rests on the very land he defended, the homestead that Sevier himself once besieged. They lie just a county apart now, enemies in life, neighbors in death. The man who upheld the law rests on his private farm, while the rebel who defied him is enshrined in the town square. This stark contrast, written in granite and soil, is the final, silent testament to their long and bitter feud. It forces us to ask the most crucial question of all. What happened in the years after the guns fell silent? How did the fugitive Nolichucky Jack not only escape justice, but rise from the ashes of his failed state to become the most powerful man in Tennessee? The long shadow of his failed state hung over John Sevier, but he was a man who thrived in the half-light. After his dramatic rescue, he was still technically a fugitive, a traitor in the eyes of North Carolina. But in the mountains and hollows of his homeland, he was simply Nolichucky Jack, their leader, protected by a fierce loyalty that no law could penetrate. He was a political ghost they couldn't exorcise. So what does a man do when his kingdom has crumbled and his enemies hold all the legal cards? He finds a new game to play. And this is where Sevier's story takes a dark, secretive turn. A desperate man, he began a clandestine correspondence with Spanish diplomats. He hinted that the frustrated people of the frontier, feeling abandoned by the United States, might be willing to secede entirely and place themselves under the protection of the King of Spain in exchange for free navigation of the Mississippi River. Was it genuine treason? Or was it the shrewdest political bluff in American history? A move designed to force the young United States to finally pay attention to its western frontier. The truth is buried with him, but it shows a man willing to risk everything to protect his interests and regain his power. Meanwhile, North Carolina faced a dilemma. They couldn't arrest Sevier. His followers would simply free him again. They couldn't ignore him. His influence was too great. They couldn't defeat him, so they did the only thing they could. They embraced him. In a stunning act of political pragmatism, they issued a full pardon for his treason. Then, they went a step further. They elected the rebel leader to their own state senate. It was a masterstroke. By bringing him into the system, they neutralized him as an outlaw. But they had underestimated Nolichucky Jack. He wasn't neutralized. He was legitimized. He took his seat in the government that had once hunted him and used his new position, combined with his undiminished popularity back home, to fight for the one thing he always wanted, a new state. But this time, done the right way. He outmaneuvered every opponent, trading his buckskin jacket for a politician's coat without ever losing the grit of the frontiersman. When Tennessee was finally granted statehood in 1796, there was no debate, no question about who would lead it. The election of John Sevier as its first governor wasn't a political victory. It was a coronation. The rebel king was dead. Long live the governor. And that's where the story gets complicated, because even today, John Sevier isn't one man, he's two. The first Sevier is the one written in stone and bronze, the man on the monument. This is Nolichucky Jack the hero, the father of Tennessee, the fearless Indian fighter who protected the fledgling settlements from annihilation. To this day, if you ask the descendants of the Over-Mountain men, they will tell you he was a patriot who risked everything at King's Mountain and a statesman who carved a civilization from a savage wilderness. This is the Sevier of public record and popular legend. But then there's the other John Sevier. This is the man whose story isn't written on monuments, but whispered in the shadows of history. To understand this Sevier, you have to stand on the other side of the Nolichucky River, on the land that was once the sovereign territory of the Cherokee Nation. From that perspective, Sevier wasn't a hero. He was the leading edge of an invasion. He wasn't a protector. He was a conqueror. Every acre of land he settled was an acre of land he took. His 35 battles weren't heroic skirmishes. They were a relentless campaign of ethnic cleansing. And it wasn't just about land for a home. The second Sevier was a ruthless speculator, a man whose patriotism and personal profit were always tangled together. His renegade state of Franklin looks less like a noble experiment in democracy and more like a massive land grab, an attempt to secure his and his cronies' illegal claims. His flirtation with Spain wasn't a bluff. It was the act of a man whose ultimate loyalty was to his own ambition. So who was the real Nolichucky Jack? Was he the courageous patriot or the greedy opportunist? The community builder or the dispossessor of a people? The truth is, he was all of it. He was a man who contained the violent, contradictory, and deeply flawed soul of the American frontier itself. And to this day in Appalachia, the version of the story you hear still depends entirely on which side of the mountain your family came from. When a man's life is as large and loud as John Sevier's, it doesn't just end when he's laid in the ground. It seeps into the soil. It becomes part of the mist that hangs in the hollows. The hard facts of his life, the battles, the politics, the betrayals, began to soften over the decades, smoothed over by time like river stones, until a new shape emerged, the shape of a legend. The most powerful legends are often the ones people needed to be true. Take the story that he fought in over 30 battles and was never once wounded. Historically, it's an incredible feat of luck and skill. But in the telling and retelling around a hearthfire, it became something more. It became proof. In a world of constant, random violence, where a snakebite or a fever could kill as surely as a tomahawk, the belief that their leader was untouchable, that he was shielded by Providence itself, wasn't just a story. It was a shield for their own hearts. But every bright legend casts a long shadow. There's another kind of story you'll hear in East Tennessee, one told in a hushed voice after the children are in bed. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is hidden and the river fog is thick, you can still hear the echoes of his forgotten wars down by the Nolichucky. They say it isn't Sevier's ghost you have to worry about. It's the ghosts of those he fought, the Cherokee spirits still bound to the land he took, their whispers of anger and loss carried on the water. It became a cautionary tale, a way for the mountains themselves to remember the price that was paid for the state he built. And so, the man became a myth. He is both the invincible hero protected by heaven and the haunted figure whose deeds left unquiet spirits in his wake. The history books tell you what John Sevier did, but it's the folklore, the ghost stories, and the tall tales whispered from one generation to the next that tell you how the mountains remember him. So we find ourselves back where we started, here on the banks of the Nolichucky. The river still speaks its ancient language, tumbling over the same stones, but we hear it differently now. We can no longer see this as just a quiet valley. We see the ghosts. We see the raw frontier, the smoke of the cabin, and the determined figure of a man who took the river's name and made it his own, bending a wilderness to his will. The journey to understand John Sevier is to understand that our heroes are never simple. It's easy to want the man on the monument to be the whole story, a flawless patriot cast in bronze. But the Appalachian frontier was no place for simple men. It demanded men who were as complex and contradictory as the land itself, men who could be both courageous and cruel, builders and destroyers, heroes and villains, sometimes all in the space of a single day. Sevier wasn't a good man who did bad things, or a bad man who did good things. He was a man of his time, and his time was a storm. So the next time you pass a forgotten ruin on a lonely road, or see an old name carved into a county courthouse, remember that it's not just a pile of stones or a word on a map. It's a library filled with stories of love, loss, and the brutal choices that define us. The story of Nolichucky Jack is a reminder that our history is not a clean, straight line. It's a tangled, bloody, and glorious thicket, and it's in those shadows and contradictions that the truest stories are found. The people are gone. The houses are gone. The world they fought for has vanished. But the story remains.